Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. And we welcome on board today one of the two authors of a book called Van Gogh, The Life, published by Random House. The author who is with us is Steven Naifeh. The author who isn't with us is Gregory White Smith, and we won't mention him anymore. If he can't show up, heck with him.
Heck with him.
Okay, I mean, he's probably the inferior of the two, and I mean, used to be friends with him, huh?
He might be listening to this. We better be careful.
Oh dear, this is a big book in every way. 953 pages, 10 years in the making. Why did it take 10 years? Oh, that's a long time even for a book.
Well, it's a long time for two people and 18 translators, 5 software engineers, and 7 researchers.
Oh my
God! It was the reason, and it's also the reason why we were surprised nobody had really ever done this. The big, ambitious biography of Vincent Van Gogh is that there's such an extraordinary amount of material to work with. You can really get inside his imagination. And it's one heck of an imagination in a way that you can't with almost any other creative figure. There's all his letters, there's the family letters, there's all the literature on him, 600 books in English alone. All the books that he read, he was a voracious reader in English, Dutch, French, and German, and we had to read everything that he read. So it was a gigantic process.
This is the way you guys do this stuff. You did the same kind of thing with Pollock.
Well, it was every bit as arduous. It was a different because he would have been about 70. Pollock, that is, when we began the book. Almost everybody he knew was still alive. So that book was based almost entirely on interviews with people who knew him. So it was very different from dealing with written sources with Van Gogh. But we have this sickness. We like the great big topic.
I couldn't help but think when I was reading the book, in terms of correspondence, which, as you just said, is more than voluminous with respect to Van Gogh, is that one of his main recipients, one of the main recipients of his letters was his brother Theo. To the extent that as I was reading along, this sounds more like today, where we have email. Anything that happened, they would write a letter. Good news, bad news, no news, on and on and on. But I guess that became the basis of their relationship.
Well, the telephones existed, but they weren't really used for much yet. They just barely existed. So the only way to communicate from a distance was by letter. And the real reason for it is that Vincent was so lonely. He couldn't make friends. He couldn't. There were months at a time when the only person he interacted with was the waitress at the cafe where he ordered his dinner. I mean, the people can sort of guess from the ear incident and from the sadness of the self-portraits just what a sad and lonely guy he was. But it's even worse. And therefore, in his letters to Theo, it was the only way he could talk about what was going on in his mind. And we're just so lucky that Theo kept all those letters. And as a result, we have this unbelievable record of his imagination. In fact, we worry about the next generation of people worthy of a biography. Unless the government opens up their data banks and lets us have their email traffic, where all that email is going to go into the ether, and we won't have the kind of record we have with Van Gogh.
We'll get a hacker.
Yes.
We'll get a hacker. Now, all of this detail, the number of people involved, I think pales in the face of what you people did with the footnotes.
Yes.
Why did you do it, and how did you execute it?
Well, I said we were sick. I've already said that we're ill. Van Gogh is so important. He's really kind of uniquely important as a cultural icon. What other sort of figure other than a pop singer gets 500,000 people to go to their grave every year and to leave mementos?
500,000?
500,000, and it's about
but then they were also going to his brother's grave.
That's true. His brother's grave too.
I really like that.
That's really touching. It's so touching that Theo's widow brought the two bodies together. It's really very, very, very touching. But it's one, his importance. Two, it's the quality of his thinking. I mean, people who haven't read the letters probably don't know that in addition to these hundreds and hundreds of glorious paintings, most of which were painted during a 2-year period, when his writing was at its best, it's serious literature. I mean, it's at the George Eliot level, and maybe even occasionally brushes the Shakespeare level.
Oh my goodness.
His profundity of thinking about art, about relationships, about the meaning of existence. So the problem was we wanted the book to read with the urgency of a novel, and a lot of people have told us that it reads like a great big 19th century novel. So all those scholarly issues, really, we knew the average, the typical reader wouldn't care just what month he entered a studio in Paris, but the scholarly community would care a lot. So we pushed thank God we live in the internet era. We were able to push 28,000 footnotes representing 6,000 pages of material onto the internet, and it's all available free to anybody who wants to go there. But the book is basically a book with words and pacing and Greg, who does the writing, a real narrative urgency.
And now people can access this by going to...
The notes are accessible by going to www.vangoghbiography.com, and it's all up there, not just with these notes, but also with pictures. More pictures than are in the book, and all the pictures that are in black and white in the book are in glorious color on the site, and there are recommendations for additional reading. There are all kinds of resources that are we think, wonderful for the reader.
The number of footnotes, the number of translators, that's seeing Van Gogh, the life from the outside. When we come back, we'll open up the book and see what's inside. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Big Book Day on Conversations on the Coast. Van Gogh, The Life is the title. It's written by Steven Naifeh and Gregory White Smith. Stephen's here, Gregory's not. The publisher is Random House, and one of the media that's liked it is a little magazine called Time.
Yes, in fact, Time almost gave us the cover, but 60 Minutes demanded that they come out first, and Time wasn't willing to come out 5 days later. So we got a nice article, but we didn't get the cover.
Goodness gracious. Part of the article. All right. Steven Naifeh and Gregory White Smith, whose 1989 biography of Jackson Pollock won the Pulitzer Prize, have written this generation's definitive portrait of the great Dutch post-impressionist, Van Gogh. Their most important achievement, and this is a rather convoluted sentence, but the point is very important. Their most important achievement is to produce a reckoning with Van Gogh's occasional madness that doesn't lose sight of the lucidity and intelligence, the profound sanity of his art. This comprehensive book gives us the full ragged glory of his life. And that's an unbelievable combination, that he would have these fits of occasional madness, which sometimes seems a lot more than occasional, and yet has the profound sanity to produce the work that he produced.
Well, people in the Van Gogh community of scholars have always been a little touchy about even talking about his insanity, although the guy did cut his ear off. He was in an insane asylum. His parents did try to get him committed.
Two insane asylums.
And if his parents had had their way, he would have gone to an insane asylum in Belgium years earlier. So it's hard to...
Well, and then there was that whole growing up period.
Yes.
When the phrases were different, they talked of him as being very, very different.
And strange.
Yeah, impossible to get along with, etc.
In fact, we now think, well, first of all, we agree not only with the main scholars at the Van Gogh Museum, but with his own doctors, that what he had was a form of epilepsy known as temporal lobe epilepsy, and it can often be congenital. And even though his family didn't know that he had this mental affliction when he was a child, reading back into it, it seems that eccentric behavior was not just an unruly child; it was somebody suffering from this mental affliction, and it helps. But back to the issue of insanity and art, you just don't. It's important to distinguish between the fact that he had these psychotic episodes, and he had a set of personality traits that collected around that mental illness, but they don't in any way keep the art from being profoundly lucid and sane. The way people ask us, what kind of effect did the insanity have on him? Two of the personality traits that come with TLE, or temporal lobe epilepsy, are one, argumentativeness. His brother Theo said he would argue you into exhaustion and then submission, and then once he'd won his point, he would then take your point and argue you into submission a whole second time. The other one was what psychiatrists call viscosity, but we lay people would call smothering behavior. He would take somebody and he would almost want to merge his life with that person. Well, to have somebody who's smothering, who also wants to argue with you 24 hours a day, makes you a very difficult person to be around, and it helps explain why he couldn't work with a community of artists. It explains why he created this extremely individual, inner-directed art. So we think the nature of his mental affliction shaped the course of his career as an artist, but it doesn't mean that the art itself is insane, because it's unbelievably profoundly sane. He never worked when he was in the middle of a psychotic episode, and you can read his descriptions of the paintings, of what he was thinking about when he made them, of his purposes, his motivations, and they are profoundly sane.
I'm sorry, I still think it's a miracle that the tremendous art came forth from this individual.
It's almost, in fact, it's a kind of religion of a sort.
Yeah.
Meaning it has a kind of religious message. The idea that somebody was able to extract works of this much beauty and this much joy out of a life of such suffering and such sadness is a kind of metaphor that a lot of us, can almost live by. I think it's one reason why people, if you walk into a room full of his paintings, or if you go to his grave and you see Japanese tourists putting the ashes of their ancestors on the grave so that they can live in eternity with the painter's Starry Night, you realize there's something beyond art and really quite spiritual taking place. And we think one of the reasons is that it is profoundly affirmative and life-affirming to think that somebody who led a life so miserable we can't even begin to imagine it could have led a life that was also this productive and has touched, after his death, millions upon millions of people.
That makes great sense as far as I'm concerned. That's about the way I read it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also it comes out of he had wanted to be a preacher before he became an artist. His father was a preacher, and he wanted to be a preacher. He just couldn't. He couldn't do the studies. He couldn't stay in college long enough. But his favorite passage from the Bible was from St. Paul to the Corinthians, sorrowful but always rejoicing. And that's what his paintings are. They're serious and even sorrowful, but always joyous and rejoicing.
What a combination.
It's a powerful combination. It helps explain why he may be everybody's favorite artist.
Oh, my
or
goodness.
Almost everybody's.
Yeah, yeah. And this notion of a family, that stayed with him forever. I
Yes.
mean, he was always trying to do that.
It's hard for those of us who, family is a crucial issue in Van Gogh's life.
Van Gogh's life has been called a heartbreaking portrait of creative genius. And when we come back, we're going to check the truth of that evaluation.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Steven Naifeh is with us today to talk about his new book, which he co-authored with Gregory White Smith. The book is Van Gogh, The Life, and man, it really is the life of Van Gogh. Somewhere in the press material, I read this, Stephen, that it was actually the other guy in answer to a question from, I think, the Columbus Dispatch. What has the reception been? To which Mr. Smith answered, I don't want to accuse you of this. We're aware of 350 newspaper articles, and we've done interviews on dozens of television programs, from Argentina to the United Kingdom to China, and 2 full segments on 60 Minutes. Now, that happened, that statement was made about the 6th of this month. So what's the new tally?
The new tally is way up around 600 articles.
You're kidding.
No, it's really a pretty astonishing. It occupied a 30-minute segment on national television in China. It's very gratifying when you're deep in a book. In the writing of the book, just the two of you for 10 years, you sort of forget the world and you just try to make it the best book you can. And then to have people take notice is really very gratifying because it isn't guaranteed.
Well, one of the places that took notice, and it's a very important place, is the New York Times Book Review. And who did this review?
Michiko Kakutani.
Yeah, you don't get any higher than
No.
or tougher.
No, we were terrified. Let me just put it. We were
every author is. They want to be reviewed by everything. Oh no, God! Oh no!
We lived in holy terror for about 3 weeks once we heard she was doing the review.
Well, here's in part what she has to say in their magisterial new biography, Van Gogh, The Life. Steven Naifeh and Gregory White Smith provide a guided tour through the personal world and the work of that Dutch painter, shining a bright light on the evolution of his art while articulating what is sure to be a controversial theory of his death at the age of 37, and we must get to that. Mr. Smith and Mr. Naifeh diligently examined the development of his ideas, his techniques, his startling ability to inhale, I love that word, inhale lessons from other painters and transform their innovations into his own. What Mr. Naifeh and Mr. Smith capture so powerfully is Van Gogh's extraordinary will to learn, to persevere against the odds. Oh, wow.
Yeah. She writes well. She may be terrifying, but she writes well.
Yeah. To keep painting when early teachers disparaged his work, when a natural facility seemed to elude him, when his canvases failed to sell. Did anything sell before he died of any consequence?
Yes, he had one sale of consequence, and it was the sister of a man he knew bought a painting called The Red Vineyard. So he did not go to his grave without a single painting sold, but it was a single painting. But he had just become, people think that he didn't become famous until after he died. Actually, a critic in Paris named Aurier, who had never met him, picked him out of the crowd and said, the most interesting painting being done today is being done by this crazy guy in an insane asylum in the south of France. And after that, some paintings were submitted to a major exhibition in Belgium, and no less a figure than Claude Monet said, this guy's doing some really interesting things. So all that happened just before he died.
Just before the end.
Yeah, just before the end.
His death is a tragedy. We'll get to how it happened. But it was also a tragedy in the sense that, to me, it seemed to have taken his brother's life almost at the same time.
Yeah, I think people, I don't want to give away the end of the book, but just let me put it this way. As sad and it really is profoundly touching, Vincent's own death at 37 was, when you're knocked out by that, something even more tragic happens in the next few pages.
Yeah, well, I kept looking for the end of the book and didn't come right away.
Yeah. No, there's more tragedy yet to come.
Yes, and then there's an appendix, isn't that what it's called?
Yes.
an appendix titled something like "How He Died."
Yeah, a note on the fatal wounding is what we do.
What happened in the woods?
It's a long story, but there have been some doubts for a long time about the traditional story. Why would he shoot himself in the stomach? Almost nobody ever does that, less than 2%. Who gave him a gun? Who would give a crazy Dutchman a gun? How did he walk all the way from the wheat fields down a deep escarpment with this terrible wound in his stomach, a mile? People think the last painting was The Crows in the Wheat Field. That was painted 2 weeks earlier. There were lots of problems with the real story. And then when you're a biographer, you're not just reading the most important things, you're reading everything. And sometimes the most interesting or key details lurk in unexpected places. And first there was the medical evidence that the wound was very unusual, and the doctor described it from too far out and from a bizarre angle, which led some people at the Van Gogh Museum in 2006 to wonder whether he could have killed himself. Then in 1956, a man named René Secretin, who had been 16 when the shooting took place, admitted finally that it was his gun. And
a nasty boy.
And a nasty boy who tormented Vincent terribly and used to get him drunk. And then we found...
But paid for it.
And he paid for the drinks, and Vincent was willing to do that.
So
And then there were these rumors in Auvers, within decades of Vincent's death, that Vincent had not committed suicide, but he had been shot accidentally by a couple of boys, and he decided to take the blame so as not to ruin their lives. So if you take all those details together, some sort of accidental shooting involving these boys seems to us a lot more plausible than the traditional theory. We put it in an appendix because we don't know for sure what happened, but we certainly know that the traditional story is problematic.
I need to congratulate you. You made it sound very plausible when you were on 60 Minutes.
Well, we are lawyers. Greg and I met in law school. This is really more of a forensic issue than it is an art history issue.
Yes, it is.
It's a criminal issue.
Van Gogh, The Life. And boy, it is a big book, a wonderful book. It has been our subject this week on Conversations on the Coast. It's by Steven Naifeh, who's here, and Gregory White Smith, who unfortunately is not. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.